Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy Booktube hats. This is Esme. She is a floof. She's on my lap right now. And today I am going to be doing another Booktube SFF Babbles video. The Booktube SFF Babbles are video prompts about science fiction and fantasy books in association with the Booktube SFF Awards. I will link all the information down below. Anyone can jump in with a video in response to the topic. And the current topic is best and worst places to live in SFF. Now I'm actually going to do this in reverse. I'm going to talk about worst first, and then I'll be able to end on a more positive note with best. But I am one of those people whose gut response to a prompt like this is, no, they're all terrible, I don't want to live in any of them, I would die. So it was interesting to take a look at my shelves and see whether or not that was actually true. And for the most part, it wasn't. I actually had a harder time finding a list of books that I had read that would be on the list of worst places to live than on the list of best. And that is because I think I actively avoid reading books that take place in the worst sorts of worlds. I don't get along with them particularly well. They are not so much to my taste. So I feel like I do have to preface this video a bit by saying that best and worst places to live of the books I've read, which kind of goes without saying, but I am a person who has not read a lot of the worst dystopias and post-apocalypses because I do not want to. There is a ton of like classic, very well-known sci-fi and fantasy that would be like the worst places to live, and I have not read them, and in many cases I do not want to. There are, however, a couple blanket statements I would like to make first about places I would not want to live in SFF based on my bookshelves and the types of things that show up a lot on them. I read a lot of historical fantasy, and I am the type of person where I get a lot of people telling me that I seem like the type of person who would like belong in a past time period, that I seem out of place in the modern world. Don't I long to live in a historical setting? And the answer to that is no. I value things like hot showers and my right to vote way too highly. I can see how you might make that assumption about me, but the answer is no. So in general, I do not want to live in the past, even in the magical alternate past. Number 2 blanket statement on places that show up kind of recurringly in my SFF reading that I do not want to live in. Okay, so if you are mortal, you do not want to live in fairy. You are not built for it. Do not try it. Again, I can understand the appeal, but no. So now, on to the dystopias and such. Because I avoid this sort of thing in my reading unless I'm like kind of peer pressured into reading these books because they are very, very popular or are nominated for awards. The first 2 series on this list are going to be, you know, books that get talked about an awful lot. They are kind of no-brainers. So first, obviously, duh, The World of the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. This is a terrible place to live. This is especially a terrible place to live during a season, which is a catastrophic geological event that makes the Earth nearly uninhabitable. A thing that happens in this world relatively frequently. But what about if there is no season at the moment you happen to be living here? Arguably also terrible. The entire structure of society is built around humanity's preparedness to survive a season should one arrive. So it is not the greatest even before you get to the society's dependence upon the oppression and abuse of origins, who are the people with the magical power to control geological activity, which is the central focus of these books. You can tell why I was scared to read these, but I'm definitely glad that I picked them up because they are as incredible as people say. And then another place that I would definitely not want to live in SFF comes from another series that I picked up for awards reading that is definitely a little bit outside my wheelhouse. That is the Hexarchate from the Machineries of Empire series by Yoon Ha Lee. This is a military sci-fi series set in a world that is definitely very cruel to its civilian populations. The Hexarchate is a massive space empire. There are so many planets full of so many people and so many cultures. So I am sure that there are places to live within the Hexarchate that have their virtues, but this is an empire where, from the military perspective and the perspective of the government, civilian populations seem to be somewhat disposable. Like, you probably don't want to exterminate entire cultures, but like, sometimes it has to happen. And that is before you get to the ritual torture of so-called heretics. In this world, the functioning of a lot of military technology is dependent on the so-called High Calendar, which is powered, made possible by the adherence of everyone in the Hexarchate to the High Calendar. And part of the High Calendar that is mandatory to keep this all fueled is like ritual torture and execution of people who are deemed to be heretics, who do not comply. So maybe you think you'll just lay low and play along and you'll be fine, except that because the High Calendar demands that there continue to be heretics to be tortured, the rules of the High Calendar have to keep being changed so as to designate more and more innocent groups of civilians as suddenly heretical. It is nuts. It is terrible. Remind me never to live in a space empire. And then I wanted to include something on this list that's sort of an older classic post-apocalypse. So I'm going to include The World of Dreamsnake by Vonda McIntyre, even though the book itself is relatively hopeful. It's been a long time since I read this, so forgive my fuzzy memory, but the main character of this book, Snake, is a character who does a lot of good, but she has a lot of good to do because the world she lives in is pretty crappy. This is like a nuclear wasteland type of post-apocalypse, where there are some people who live in a city that is all walled off, and no one from the outside is left in. Everyone on the outside is left like struggling in the waste. Snake is a healer, and beyond physical healing, there's a lot she can do to help people. But there is also a lot of ignorance and a lot of suffering. And even with people like Snake in this world, I would not want to live in it. Now, the next series I want to talk about is another very popular one with all of the awards buzz. But this is where I'm going to bridge from worst to best. And this is a series that I think contains some of each. And that's the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. I don't think it will be at all unusual or controversial for me to put, say, the Exodus fleet from this series in my list of best places to live. Even the larger world of this series, with all its good and bad, has a lot of appeal. It feels a lot like our own, but like in space with aliens. But there are also places in this world that are definitely among the worst places to live. I would like to remind you now of the child slave labor dystopia planet where Pepper grew up in a closed and common orbit. And yes, we know she gets out of there and has a better life, but the whole half of this book that follows her childhood is pretty much dystopian. She and all of these other like genetically modified girls are being raised in this like factory doing like tech work with no knowledge whatsoever of the outside world. And even when she escapes this factory, the haven she finds in like this junkyard is pretty bleak. It is nothing whatsoever like growing up on the Exodus fleet in Record of a Spaceborne Few. The Exodus fleet on which humans fled Earth is remarkable even within this vast interplanetary multi-species society for being essentially a non-capitalist society where no one goes hungry, everyone is provided for. Everyone is expected to work and give back, and a lot of people who grow up there leave because there is no, big exciting adventure or glory or success like there might be tantalizingly in the rest of the universe, and there's a lot of appeal in that. But in a universe that contains horrific places like where Pepper grew up, The safety and security of the Exodus fleet is really something very special. Another series that contains a major social experiment, sort of like the Exodus fleet is in the Wayfarers series, is the Thessaly Trilogy by Jo Walton, which consists of The Just City, The Philosopher Kings, and Necessity, which focus on a fantastical effort by the time-traveling Greek gods to set up Plato's Republic. Can they found a truly just city on this model? Well, not exactly. There are a lot of flaws and imperfections and a lot of things that do not go according to plan. By the end of this series, the city looks very, very different than it did at the beginning. But even if by the time we get to the end, the city does not look exactly like Plato might have imagined it, there are aliens and robots, it's still a pretty dang good place to live. And it's a good place to live because it is full of people who are committed to making it so. But I've been thinking up till this point sort of on a broad societal level, like, where are the best places to live in SFF? On a more personal level, there are books with settings that speak more directly to me. They are places I would like to live. The first among those is one that I mentioned when a similar sort of question came up in the hopeful book tag, where would you want to live? And that is the world of the Tea Dragon Society, a middle grade graphic novel by Katie O'Neill. We don't know much about the broader world building of this series, but it's very inclusive. It's very, like, small town. It's full of people who are friendly and caring. It's full of craftspeople plying their trades in peace. And it turns out there are little bitty tea dragons. What more can you want? It turns out I have a thing for, like, idyllic rural fantasy settings. It is quite possibly because I have lived in cities all of my life, and so I idealize the rural lifestyle, especially if there's magic. But another book with a cozy rural setting that I would love to escape into is an old favorite that I recently reread, Chalice by Robin McKinley, which takes place in a small demesne called Willowlands. This is a world where the land itself is magical and sort of alive in its own way and bound to the leaders of the community. And while there is a huge disruption by Willowland standards that happens in this book, like compared to end of the world stuff in other fantasy novels, like, this is small stuff. And spoiler alert, it all ends up all right in the end. I would like to live in a small magical fantasy town where this is the worst that could happen. Yes, I would. Of course, the all-time classic cozy rural fantasy setting, if I'm talking about cozy rural fantasy settings, is the Shire from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which is the place where hobbits live out their normal lives, living in hobbit holes and eating so much food. Of course, this world is threatened by much bigger epic doom, but it is the desire to protect the normalcy of a place in this world like the Shire that gives this series a good deal of its heart. So that's the end of my list, but I do want to say one more thing before I go. I mentioned at the beginning that I took a look at my shelves for this prompt, trying to find settings that were the best and the worst to live in. And my conclusion upon doing that was actually that the majority of the books and series that I enjoy reading are like our world, somewhere in the middle. There are a lot of terrible things that happen to a lot of people in a lot of these books, but that also doesn't mean that normalcy and happy lives don't exist in these worlds in this setting. Whether these places are good or bad ones to live in would depend a whole lot on who you are and what your circumstances are, just like in our world. And an author can shape our perception of whether this world is really great or really terrible, depending on who they choose to write about. Taking a step back from the characters and the stories of the individual books, it's sometimes hard to tell, would this really be a good place to live for, like, a normal person? And a lot of the time it could really go either way. Also, a lot of the time, the things I remember most strongly about books that I read longer ago are the plots and the characters, not necessarily the details of the world building. So anyways, those are my thoughts. Let me know if any of these books would be on your best or worst places to live list. Let me know not what your worst would be. Let me know what places you think would be the best to live in SFF. Okay, that's all. I hope you're having a nice day. Bye for now.